All right, everyone, we're jumping headfirst into the turbulent waters of global trade and politics today.
Sounds intense.
Oh, it is. We're specifically looking at President Trump's bombshell announcement, but those new tariffs on imports from China, Canada, and Mexico.
Oh, right. The ones that have the whole market on edge.
Exactly. Everyone's trying to figure out what this means, what happens next. I mean, this move has really sent shockwaves.
It's certainly a big deal, a bold move, to say the least, especially because he's implementing them right away. Usually, with trade actions this big, there's a sort of phase-in period. Businesses need time to adjust.
That's what's so surprising, I think.
Right.
It's like, boom, here they are. Deal with it. And we actually got a great article here. It really lays it all out. It's called Trump's New Tariffs, China, Canada, Mexico Trade Policy.
Catchy title.
Right. So we're talking about a 25% tariff on some goods from Canada and Mexico. And then there's the existing 10% tariff on a bunch of Chinese imports. That one's going up to 20%.
Wow, so those are some significant increases. No wonder everyone's scrambling.
Yeah, so the big question is why? What's the strategy here? Why this sudden drastic change?
Well, the article highlights a few of Trump's stated goals. He's talking about protecting American industries, especially manufacturing and steel. They've been facing a lot of competition from overseas. And he wants to put pressure on China to change what he sees as unfair trade practices. And of course, to reduce the U.S. trade deficit.
Right. The trade deficit, that's the familiar tune. And then there's the whole immigration angle too, right?
Yeah.
Trump saying these tariffs will help curb illegal immigration from Canada and Mexico. But honestly, that feels a little like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
It does seem a bit mismatched, yeah.
Is there even a real connection there?
It's definitely a controversial part of this whole thing. And whether it'll actually work, well, that's debatable. A lot of critics are saying that tariffs are just too blunt of a tool for dealing with something as complex as immigration. And they could backfire, cause unintended consequences. For businesses and consumers on both sides of the border, it's not that simple.
Okay, so we've got the what, these big tariffs, and the why. Protect American industries, pressure China, curb immigration, according to Trump. But will it actually work? What could happen, both here and internationally?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Domestically, Trump seems to be betting that these tariffs will resonate with his base, especially those who feel left behind by globalization. He's painting it as a battle, to protect American jobs and interests. It's a theme he's used before successfully.
Definitely sounds familiar. But the article also mentions that we could see pushback from retail and manufacturing. They're saying these tariffs could actually hurt American businesses and consumers.
Yeah.
So is Trump risking alienating a big chunk of the American economy?
Yeah, there's a real chance of that. I mean, if businesses start to feel the squeeze from these tariffs, they're going to speak up. And that could put pressure on lawmakers, to rethink their support. Some industry groups are already voicing concerns about higher prices, disruptions in supply chains, that sort of thing.
Makes sense. And internationally.
Yeah.
China, Canada, Mexico, they're not just going to sit there and take it, right? What's their response been? What are they saying they might do?
They're not happy, that's for sure. They've made that very clear. China especially has been pretty vocal. They're accusing the U.S. of protectionism, and they're threatening retaliation. In fact, they've already added a 15% tariff on U.S. agricultural products. And they've hinted at more measures, maybe targeting soybeans, electronics, automobiles.
Wait a minute. Those industries, those sound really familiar. Were those key to Trump's base back in 2016 and 2020? Is China maybe being strategic here, targeting sectors that could actually weaken Trump's political support?
Interesting point. Yeah, it's definitely possible that China's response is very calculated, that they're trying to inflict maximum political damage, hit those industries that are crucial for Trump's base, that could erode his support and put more pressure on him to back down.
So China's playing hardball, using their economic power, maybe even trying to mess with American politics. What about Canada and Mexico? How are they reacting to all this?
Well, let's just say they're not exactly throwing parties. Canada's thinking about hitting back with their own tariffs on U.S. dairy, steel, and machinery.
Ooh, those are some big industries.
Yeah, they're definitely key sectors for American producers. So it would be a real blow if they went through with it. And then there's Mexico. They're calling for diplomacy, trying to talk things out.
That sounds more reasonable.
It does, but they've also made it clear that if the talks go nowhere, they'll retaliate too. So there's still a lot of tension there.
This feels like we're on the brink of a trade war. And for our listeners who maybe aren't totally up on trade lingo, can you explain what that actually means? Like, what would a trade war look like?
Sure. Basically, a trade war is like a tit for tat between countries. They keep slapping tariffs on each other's goods, trying to protect their own industries, but it often ends up hurting everyone. It's kind of like an arms race, but with economics.
So instead of stockpiling weapons, they're stockpiling tariffs.
Exactly. And sometimes it goes beyond tariffs. They might use quotas or other barriers to trade, but the idea is the same. It's a way to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. But it often backfires.
And it can get really messy, right? Like, what are the consequences if this actually escalates into a full-blown trade war? What kind of impact could it have, both for the global economy and for, just everyday people?
Well, imagine this. Prices for everything start going up. Your groceries, your gas, your clothes, everything gets more expensive because those tariffs are driving up the cost of imports.
So basically, inflation goes through the roof.
Exactly. And businesses start struggling, supply chains get disrupted, costs increase, that could lead to job losses, and slower economic growth. And then there's the stock market. Investors get spooked by all the uncertainty, so the market gets more volatile. It's not a pretty picture.
Yikes. That's a lot to worry about. So what about international organizations? Like the WTO, can't they step in and, be the referee, keep things from spiraling out of control?
Well, the WTO does have a role to play. They can investigate claims of unfair trade practices, and if they find something fishy, they can authorize retaliatory measures. But here's the thing. The WTO relies on countries actually cooperating and following the rules. And in this climate, with all this nationalism and protectionism, that cooperation is getting harder and harder to come by.
So the WTO is kind of like a referee with no real power.
In a way, yeah, they can blow the whistle, but they can't really force anyone to play fair.
Okay, so we've got this potential trade war brewing. It could have a huge impact on the economy, and the WTO might not be able to do much about it. But let's zoom out for a second. Look at the bigger picture. What does this aggressive trade policy tell us about the future of, global cooperation? Is this just a temporary blip, or are we seeing a shift towards more protectionism and isolationism?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, no one really knows the answer. Some people think it's just a negotiating tactic, like Trump's trying to strong-arm everyone into giving the U.S. better deals. They think cooler heads will prevail, and eventually everyone will compromise.
It's a lot of bluster, but not a lot of substance.
Maybe. But others are more pessimistic. They see this as part of a bigger trend towards economic nationalism. Countries are starting to prioritize their own interests, and they're not as willing to cooperate globally anymore.
So are we heading towards a future where everyone's just building walls instead of bridges? What would that mean for the world?
It's definitely a possibility. And it could be pretty scary. We could see the global economy fragment, trade and investment would slow down, growth would stall, geopolitical tensions would probably rise. It would basically undo decades of progress towards a more interconnected world.
Okay, so that's a pretty grim picture. Lots of uncertainty, potential for conflict, and the risk of undoing a lot of good work.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to process. But the main point is that these trade disputes, even though they might seem abstract, can have real-world consequences for people, for families.
Like we've talked about, higher prices, job losses, economic instability. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Right, exactly. And it goes beyond just economics, too. There are political and social implications as well. This kind of stuff can fuel nationalism, erode trust between countries. It makes it harder to deal with shared challenges like climate change or pandemics. So even though it's tempting to just ignore it all, it's really important to stay informed and engaged.
So this trade war thing, it's not just some abstract political game. It could really mess things up for people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It has the potential to really disrupt people's lives in very real ways. We've talked about inflation, right?
Yeah. If these tariffs make imported goods more expensive, that hits consumers right in the wallet.
Exactly. Everything could get more expensive. Groceries, electronics, clothes, you name it.
And if the U.S. economy takes a hit because China and others retaliate,
well, then you could see a ripple effect through the whole job market.
Job losses, slower economic growth, that would affect pretty much everyone.
Exactly, not just the people directly involved in trade. And don't forget about the stock market. All this uncertainty could really shake things up.
Yeah, retirement savings, investments, it's a lot to think about.
It really is, and that's why it's so important for people to stay informed, to understand how these policies could affect them personally.
So don't just tune out the headline.
Right, pay attention to how these things are affecting prices, businesses, the economy as a whole.
Okay, so we've laid out some pretty serious potential consequences. What can people do to stay informed and, maybe even do something about it?
Well, I think the most important thing is to stay curious. Read articles from different sources, listen to podcasts, get different perspectives. Talk to people, friends, family, colleagues. Challenge your own assumptions. Be open to new information.
And don't be afraid to speak up. Contact your elected officials.
Absolutely. Let them know what you think. Participate in the political process. Vote. Contact your representatives. Support organizations that are fighting for fair trade policies. In a democracy, citizens have power. They can shape the future.
Well, we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. We've talked about these new tariffs, the potential trade war, what it all means for global cooperation. It's complicated stuff, for sure.
Yeah, it is. But hopefully we've made it a little bit clearer, provided some food for thought.
And if you're interested in hearing more discussions like this, be sure to subscribe to Global Talks. We dive into the world's most pressing issues. We'll keep you informed, engaged, and ready to navigate this crazy, interconnected world we live in. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.